Hey, young historians, Mr. Brand here, and I'm going to be reading this document. The anger is brewing. The American colonists were alarmed by what they saw as a conspiracy against their liberty. They feared that the corruption and the abuses of power by the British government would taint their own society. And further, they were troubled by the knowledge that they had no say over a government 3,000 miles away. So here is a list of some of the acts the British government passed that alarmed the American colonists. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Molasses Act, which was passed in 1733. And this levied a high tax on rum, molasses, and sugar shipped from non-British colonies. The colonists opposed this act on the grounds that it sought to protect English rum and molasses and sugar companies and hurt the French or the foreign companies at the colonists' expense. So basically, the English were saying, hey, you know what? We want you to buy English products, not the French, not the foreign products. You can buy those, but it's going to cost you more. And then here you have a link to a very short video that talks about that. And then there was the Iron Act passed in 1750 after Parliament passed the Iron Act, which impeded or slowed down the development of iron manufacturing in the colonies. Benjamin Franklin published a treatise, or like a short pamphlet, denouncing the absurdity of restraining the colonies' economic growth. And then the Stamp Act was passed in 1765. And this was to help cover the cost of militarily defending the colonies. Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which required a tax stamp on all legal documents, almanacs, newspapers, pamphlets, and playing cards. This was the first direct tax Parliament applied to the colonies and a violation of the idea that only the colonies' legislative assemblies could impose taxes. Suspected violators were tried in admiralty courts without juries. Colonists boycotted British goods and intimidated stamp distributors into resigning. They protested the Stamp Act on two grounds. Number one, that it represented taxation without representation, and that it deprived colonists of the right to trial by jury. Outside of Georgia, or the colony of Georgia, no stamps were ever sold. London merchants ultimately persuaded Parliament to repeal the act. The Stamp Act made many Americans realize for the first time that the British government may not really represent the best interests of the colonies. And again, I have a short video that goes into a little bit more detail about the Stamp Act. And then there was the Declaratory Act. So as soon as the Stamp Act was repealed, Congress passed the Declaratory Act. And it was passed unanimously. And this just basically told the colonists, you know what? We have the right to govern the colonies, and we can and we will make any laws we want or taxes we want. And so that was sending a clear message to the colonists about who the boss was. And then in 1765, there was a Quartering Act, and this required colonial governments to put up British soldiers in homes or inns, and an inn's like an old-fashioned motel, and provide them with candles, bedding, and beverages. So the government wasn't paying them to house these troops. It was just the law. You have to do this. Then you had the Townshed Act, imposed taxes on imports of glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea to the colonies. Revenue from the acts paid for the salaries of colonial governors and judges. And so here again, I have a link to the Townshed Acts there. And then in 1770, after discovering the Townshed Acts raised very little money, the British government repealed it, except the tax on tea. And this was like a reminder to the colonists about who's in power. Okay. And then in 1773, there was the Tea Act. Parliament passed the Tea Act that authorized the East India Company to sell tea directly to American distributors. Cutting out the wholesaler profits would make the English tea cheaper than tea smuggled in from Holland. And this was a big problem with the colonies, was there was a lot of smugglers. In fact, some of the most famous founders of our country were smugglers. John Hancock, who signed his signatures, the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence. He was a very well-known smuggler. He became very wealthy because he smuggled items into the colonies. And then 1774, Virginia took the lead in opposing British policies. Local committees called for the support of Boston and the elimination of all trade with Britain. So in Boston, there was a lot of stuff going on. We're going to learn about that in the next couple of days. And so Virginia was like, hey, we need to support our brothers and sisters in Boston. Now, this isn't an act, but because of all these acts, this is the very beginnings of the American Rebellion, because they're calling for local committees to be set up. And these local committees then would eventually send representatives to a national convention, which became known as the Congress. And then the Congress would start organizing how they're going to deal with the British government. So this is this document, and hopefully it will help you in the next part of this assignment where you're creating your protest cards. Thanks, historians. Have a great day.